This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. So glad you're joining us to talk about the cultural issues of our day from a Christian worldview. Got a lot of things to get to on today's program. Pleased again to be joined by Shane Morris. Shane from sunny Florida, while I am spending a couple days in sunny Phoenix, which may explain some background noise at the conference center that I'm at. But at any rate, we'll try to get to all the stories that we can today. Shane, hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great, John. My sympathy is that you're not here in Florida with me, but Phoenix sounds nice.
Phoenix is nice. I was telling the group that I was speaking to last night that I was kind of having an out-of-body experience because I started in Colorado Springs, then went to New York City. And, you know, very Christmased up this time of year, New York City. It's a great time to be in New York City. But you freeze to death. You know, you pay a price in order to see all those Christmas decorations.
Yeah.
And coming to Phoenix, it's pretty lit up here too. But it's weird to be kind of all lit up for Christmas but not be freezing.
Yeah, and then, you know, the best part about being out west anywhere during the winter is you get clear skies. The thing I hate about winter the most on the East Coast is that it's overcast most of the time. Here in Florida, we don't have that problem. But yeah, Colorado, Arizona, whatever. It's all great. Yeah,
no, it's really true. It's really great. Well, I want to jump right to our first story, and it's kind of a breaking one here as we record on Friday morning. In just a couple hours in Washington, D.C., Representative Chris Stewart, from a Republican from Utah, is going to introduce a bill that we've talked about in bits and pieces on Breakpoint and Breakpoint This Week. I remember Ed Stetzer and I talking about it, but it's a significant piece of legislation. And in fact, I think that it dramatically fails. It's a troubling piece of legislation. It's an attempt to compromise with so-called SOGI legislation. Now, SOGI legislation stands for sexual orientation and gender identity. And many of our listeners would have heard an awful lot about the Equality Act. The Equality Act is an attempt to put sexual orientation and gender identity on the same level, the same status as race in federal legislation, particularly the Civil Rights Act, and then that would affect all federal funding sources and all of that. Now, the Civil Rights Act was an act by the federal government to ensure public accommodation by racial and ethnic minorities. And we're talking here basically to overturn Jim Crow. I mean, this was a time when African Americans driving across certain parts of the country couldn't make it. I mean, they literally would not be granted a place to stay in a hotel. There wasn't a gas station where they could get gas. And in order to ensure their full participation in society, the Civil Rights Act just made that possible. Putting sexual orientation and gender identity on the same plane, smuggling into the Civil Rights Act, is an attempt to ensure public accommodation on those categories. Now, of course, the first question, in fact, my daughter and I had this conversation just last night. We were talking through this, and I said, what's the difference? And really, Shane, she immediately got it. And it's very important, before we go further and really describe the fairness for all, that our listeners get the difference here when we talk about adding sexual orientation and gender identity to something as sweeping as the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, the fundamental claim of the LGBT movement for a long time now, and it's becoming less so in recent years, but the fundamental claim has been that sexual orientation, gender identity are things on par with race, right? You're born this way. It's something that's immutable. It's a characteristic that you can't change even if you try. I'm just quoting song lyrics right and left here, John. Yeah, that's the propaganda. And of course, I think that's fundamentally mistaken, and the way that the movement has sort of moved beyond that since to me indicates that that's true, that it is nothing more than a propaganda piece, because the reality is people change over the course of their lives. There's no evidence scientifically that these are immutable characteristics. In fact, even from the beginning with the famous book After the Ball, which sort of laid out the agenda early on for the gay rights movement back in the 1980s, I believe, the authors admit that, well, look, we know that sexual orientation is the result of a confluence of environmental factors and potentially biological factors and relational factors, but it's useful to say that it's just like the color of your skin. So we're going to say that, and that's going to be how we win the culture. And it was how they won the culture. Now we have to ask the question, given the fact that we know this is not true and that behavior is not equivalent to race, it's not an immutable characteristic, sexual behavior and all that, should we be enshrining it in the Civil Rights Act in a way that protects these groups, as these ever-proliferating groups, I might add, on the same level as race.
Yeah, that's right. And the second component of this is that this was at a time, again, when African Americans were not allowed to participate in wider society. In other words, there were no public accommodations available in large geographic swaths of periods. I asked my daughter again this last night, and I said, what's the difference? And she said, well, in the case, for example, of Jack Phillips, the baker, when the two individuals came in and asked for a same-sex wedding cake, they could have just gone down the street. And that's absolutely the case. We're not overturning this widespread systemic discrimination that's at the same level of the Civil Rights Act. That's at the level of the issue that the Civil Rights Act was trying to address. And that's a very, very important distinction as well. Now, put all that, we've talked about the Equality Act, that's the fear. And I think in particular coming in to 2016, there were widespread beliefs that the election would not have gone this direction that it did. It was going to go in a different direction. If you remember the last few years of President Obama's administration, and Shane, we talked about this as well, where it seemed like the top issue in both his domestic and foreign agenda were to advance LGBT rights. Remember the Dear Colleague letter threatening to withhold Title IX and Title X funding from educational institutions if people did not open restrooms up to individuals of both genders. And then we could go on and on and on. Now, Fairness for All is largely modeled after what's called the Utah Compromise. Now, let me just explain that. The Utah Compromise was a state-level legislative solution that was largely pushed by the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, to try to find a reasonable balance between religious freedom and SOGI laws. Because as we know, people of conscience who do not believe, as you put it, the propaganda has advanced, that sexual orientation and gender identity is intrinsic, it's racial, and believe that the behavioral component to this is sinful. People who believe that, if the SOGI laws go into effect at the level of civil rights enforcements, now all of a sudden you have infringements on religious liberty. Of course, we've seen that. Think Barronelle Stutzman, think Jack Phillips. We can just go down the line. Think the challenges to Christian colleges in California just a couple of years ago. So the Utah Compromise basically said, look, we'll grant SOGI categories in state law in Utah. Just let us have exemptions because of religious convictions in our institutions. And it was a disaster, at least in two ways. First, it put SOGI as a category of human being into law. That's simply not true. And when you advance something that's not true in law, there's going to be consequences of it. Mainly that essentially anybody who wants an exemption really on the condition of bigotry. It's kind of like, let's let us be bigots in our own houses of worship and our own institutions. So it immediately puts a separation there, and it holds back the truth-telling ability of religious institutions on a very, very important issue in terms of sexual morality, not to mention human identity. The second thing that it really does is it immediately puts anyone outside of religious institutions on the wrong side of the law and limits their religious freedom. Drawing that line at religious institutions means who gets to decide who the religious institutions are. Of course, we remember during the HHS mandate that under the Obama administration, that was drawn in very, very narrow categories. But it also means anyone who runs a faith-owned business. They want to basically bring their public faith into their public lives. If they don't count as a nonprofit, a 501c3, a certain size 501c3 or a church, they're not able to do that. In other words, these sorts of compromises put Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman immediately outside of protection. This is essentially what Fairness for All is an attempt to do. It's an attempt, and I think it's a well-intended attempt to try to find a balance between something just kind of acknowledging this is the reality, that we do have this push towards SOGI legislation and SOGI protection, so it's better to have some protections than no protections, and we really can all just get along on this. Yeah. The problem is that it's saying something that's not true, which I can never get behind as a legislative solution. And secondly, it leaves people of faith who aren't in the private sector, who aren't in churches and houses of worship and so on, outside of religious protections. And if I think that the pastor deserves freedom and the professor at a Christian college deserves freedom, I got to think the plumber deserves freedom too, and the baker, and the florist, and people like that. So that's the real issue behind Fairness for All.
So John, what you're telling me is that Fairness for All is not peace in our time? It's not.
Well, no, it's not. And it's not really fairness at the end of the day. It's because it does leave so many people out. Again, I mean, some of the individuals that are behind this, I think I would consider friends, and I want to be clear on this. And I also want to say that I think the intentions are good. I think it was conceived under a time when we thought the judiciary was going to be completely different because we were going to have a different president than we do right now.
Sure.
And the fact of the matter is the Supreme Court is completely different than when this was conceived. And also the top agenda items from groups like HHS and other places have completely changed because of this administration. So I think that's completely different. And I just can't get behind this. And I think it's basically the playing field on this has kind of been reset, at least during this administration. And to give up, I think, more than a 50-yard line. Sorry, Shane, I'm using a football analogy here. I know we've talked about this in the past.
These are opaque to me, John. I don't understand what you're talking about.
So at any level, we're giving up more than half the field right off the bat, and I think that's problematic. Now, for the record, I don't think Fairness for All really has a chance to go forward. I don't think it's going to come out of the House. First of all, that the House is controlled by the Dems. The Dems don't want to compromise. They don't think there needs to be a compromise on this. Religious freedom is the bad person in this, at the table. So this compromise solution really doesn't have a future. But it's just something that I think it's worth talking about because it'll make the news here. As I understand it, it's always dangerous to do these recordings leading into the news conference is going to happen in D.C. at noon. Yeah, you never know if that's really going to happen, but that's what I've been told, and I wanted to have this conversation. Well, listen, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm here with Shane Morris. We're talking about the stories of our culture from a Christian worldview. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources. And you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, before we get to our next story, I do want to say thanks to all of our listeners. So many of them went online, they called in, they mailed in donations to support us this past week on Giving Tuesday. Giving Tuesday has become a great, I think, antidote to the early commercialization of Christmas between Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And I know many of my ministry colleagues as well experienced just wonderful support from their supporters on Giving Tuesday. And that gives me encouragement and hope. And we are grateful not only for any support that you were able to give to the Colson Center, but to any of the ministry partners that we talk about and mention, your churches and other folks who do the very difficult work of caring for the needy, the poor, those with disability, all the different organizations that were part of Giving Tuesday. So thank you for giving that the way you did. And of course, you don't just have to give on Tuesday. You can give it any day of the week. Just go to breakpoint.org/give. Speaking of giving, and speaking of Giving Tuesday, and this will fall into the category, Shane, of you just can't be woke enough these days. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, somebody that we've talked about on more than one occasion, running for president. I think, by the way, I don't make predictions, but if I did, I think he's one to watch who may emerge as the Democratic nominee.
Well, we got to stop talking about him on Breakpoint this week because it's boosting his poll numbers.
we might be. He's polling at 0 with African Americans, as we mentioned before. This past week, he lined up with Pastor William Barber, who's a prominent African-American pastor in North Carolina. So it may seem like he's trying to address at least that issue. But he's under fire this week for something completely different. The Salvation Army. When did the Salvation Army become such a controversial organization?
I don't know. It's dizzying. It's just like, I feel like somebody woke up 3 months ago and decided the Salvation Army was now persona or organization non grata. And all of a sudden everyone's trying to distance themselves from and break ties with the Salvation Army.
Yeah, that's right. And so he basically joined, stood outside and rang a bell, and suddenly he's under fire.
Let's just stop for a second. He stood outside and rang a bell on behalf of the homeless. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, that's not woke at all. Yeah, of course, it has to do with the reputation that the Salvation Army has when it comes to LGBT issues. And of course, not that they don't serve LGBT homeless youth. I think, as they said after the ChickfilA brouhaha, they probably serve more LGBT homeless youth than anybody in America right now. They welcome everyone in terms of who they will serve. Now, who they'll employ, although I think they actually employ people, members of the LGBT community, as I know it. But in their statement of beliefs, what they say is very clearly that they hold to a traditional biblical ethic on these things. And Salvation Army isn't a right-wing conservative organization. I mean, there's plenty of ways that I would disagree with some of the stances that they take on some of these different controversial issues. I think abortion, for example. I'm going off not having studied closely their statement of belief, but these are things that I've seen recently. But you might remember, that was the organization that was targeted by opponents of ChickfilA. That's the organization that ChickfilA announced they were no longer supporting. And so here you have Mayor Pete under fire for really ringing a bell. I mean, it's you kind of think back through this past year, and 2019 is so interesting. This past week, and a Canadian bioethicist, said in 2019 we shouldn't be talking about whether doctors should have to perform abortions or not, or can step out of gender reassignment surgery because of their deeply held religious convictions. It's 2019.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, because religious freedom and freedom of conscience is so 2018. I mean, it does seem like things that having to do with going from unthinkable to tolerable have moved to unquestionable really in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, I think there was a large segment of the population that was expecting the Overton window to continue moving to the left at the same pace it had in the Obama administration, and now they're kind of beating at a wall, wondering why they can't see the sky. Do you now, or have you ever been a supporter of the Salvation Army territory? It's this kind of McCarthyism in the gay rights movement would make McCarthy blush. But I think the first interesting thing to note here is that because Chick-fil-A has sort of taken itself out of the culture wars, or tried to, the pressure on the Salvation Army is now greater. We need to take note of this. There are consequences to the type of maneuvering or caving, or whatever you want to call it, that Chick-fil-A tried a couple of weeks ago by ending donations to the Salvation Army and distancing themselves from the organization, and switching to more progressive charities. Not only do I think it won't help Chick-fil-A in the long run, but it's all been an admission that the Salvation Army is homophobic. It's kind of like what you talked about earlier, John, with the Fairness for All laws, where it's moving back further than you need to for no good reason. You're admitting, albeit implicitly, that bigotry is a category, that holding to traditional religious convictions is a bigoted thing to do, so we should just carve out a space for them to exist. When you divest from the Salvation Army or a similar organization doing good work because of their stance on traditional marriage and sexuality, you're implicitly saying this organization is bigoted, and that increases the heat on them significantly.
I think what a lot of people want to know, and I'd love to hear your thought on this, is this an overplay? I mean, is this kind of come back to bite the movement? I mean, we've talked, for example, about the overplay of the transgender side of this, where even Martina Navratilova, who was one of the first public lesbians in America, in American history, basically, but is not woke enough because of suggesting it's not biologically fair for a man to play against a woman in tennis. Mm-hmm. And so, she's called a trans exclusionary radical feminist. And for the kids at home, that's what TERF means. If you ever hear someone called TERF, that's what it means. It's not a compliment. She's not woke enough. And you think about the scene Rod Dreher wrote about this week in Olympia, Washington, where the city council tried to honor the Trans Day of Remembrance. Now, the Trans Day of Remembrance is a day meant to honor trans individuals who have died because of their gender identity. But what they did, they protested that they weren't honoring it honoringly enough, I guess.
Yeah.
Arguing that police officers should have to leave the building because they were transphobic or something like that. And then there was a scene from going back to Mayor Pete, mentioning him again. He should pay us as a campaign guy.
He really should.
By the way, we are not at any level endorsing his candidacy, but there was this remarkable scene at a Mayor Pete rally this week, or kind of a town hall meeting, where a white gay activist who's part of the Mayor Pete campaign takes the mic from an African American and talks to them about not being woke enough. And it was just a train wreck. And you're like, have we reached a tipping point here? Is there going to be a public reaction to this? You know, I was in the Minnesota airport. The lines were still long at ChickfilA. You know, I'm not sure that it's going to change a lot. Maybe it will. It certainly is. You know, I know I've talked to plenty of Christians who say that they're not going to go back to Chick-fil-A, or, you know, they're uncomfortable with it now or whatever. I'm not advocating any of that, certainly. I'm just saying, has this sort of stuff reached a tipping point, Shane? Do you think that we're going to see a backlash now and kind of a return to somewhat of a middle ground of sanity here?
Well, that's the really interesting part about the Mayor Pete thing to me, is that he's the best chance the LGBT movement has had to get someone in the White House ever. I mean, he's gotten further than anyone else identifying that way has. And yet, they're willing to go after him for the seemingly minor infraction. You know, I don't even know if it was widely understood in that niche community back in 2017 or whenever it was that he rang bells for the Salvation Army, that the Salvation Army was a problematic organization. The sexual rights crowd is cannibalizing its own right now, and some of its best and brightest. Like I said, he's the best chance they've ever had of getting in the White House. The ideological purity, or the devotion to ideological purity, the demand that you be faultlessly loyal to the cause, are all the highest priorities of this movement. I think it's a sign, a potentially hopeful sign, that the movement is overly obsessed with these things and is actually going to, you know, devour itself, cannibalize itself. Yesterday's vanguards of the revolution are tomorrow's retrograde bigots, John.
Yeah, that's right. Well, listen, we're running up to the end of the program here, but I do want to mention one more story. A very interesting headline recently. A survey of 20 to 34-year-olds in the United Kingdom found that 94% of them had heard of the pop singer Adele. And that makes sense. I mean, she's a big deal. But 75% of them had never heard of Mozart. 1 in 5 think that Bach, who died in 1750, is still alive. We've talked before. I mean, there are books that we continually come back and reference, and one of them, if you want a Christmas gift to buy for the resident nerd in your house, please pick up Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. There's a lot that can be said. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that you can see a lot about what's happening in the culture by the state of its art, the decadence of its art. How much trouble are we in if 94% know Adele and only 25% know Mozart? Well,
we talked about this in our editorial meeting, John, and the football we sort of threw around here, see, I did it again, was whether this is a symptom of, you know, progressivism or just modernity as a whole. And one of our writers, I said, well, this is the progressive mindset, right? That the past is not worth engaging with. Those are all just a bunch of dead, bigoted white guys, and, you know, who cares about them anyway? On with Adele. But one of our writers pushed back, and I think he had a good point. He said that if you had polled American evangelicals and asked them the same questions, probably there would be similar numbers, right? A similar number of American evangelicals wouldn't know who Bach was or who Mozart was. And there would be this sort of widespread cultural illiteracy. And I think he had a good point there.
Well, I think that might actually be the case. And I think it's absolutely true. This is the power of culture, right? It's not just kind of consciously heard ideas like, oh, we're going to, you know, reject anything from the past or anything from this source or that source. Although that happens a lot on college campuses. But the power of modernity is just kind of sweeping us up into what C.S. Lewis called a chronological snobbery, right? Which is that anything newer is necessarily better, anything shinier. And it also reduces our taste buds, or it eliminates our taste buds. So we look for that thing that can elicit a reaction rather than that which makes us stop and ponder and think. We're just not a culture that does that. And classical music, great art, it forces us to stop and to think and to ponder and to reflect. I mean, that's what makes the great stuff great, is that it deals with kind of the ultimate questions of life, and it touches you at a level that goes beyond just kind of an immediate surface level sensation.
Well, the thing you said about chronological snobbery, and I think that was it Owen Barfield who came up with that phrase originally? And then
I always thought it was C.S. Lewis, but I credit C.S. Lewis for everything.
Lewis uses it, and I often falsely credit him with that as well, John. But that's exactly right. It's the mindset that nothing that came before my lifetime really matters or should hold my attention. And Lewis talks about this also in his essay, The Reading of Old Books, where he says that you have to let the fresh breeze of the centuries blow through, the sort of fusty, shut-up house of modernity, so that you can recognize your own blind spots and your own foibles, right? That's the sort of thing that classical music or classical literature or any of these things are able to do for us. And that, to me, is a call to the church every bit as much as it is to, secular progressives to rediscover the great heritage of our civilization, to listen to Bach, to know who he is and why he matters, and why even after Adele is long forgotten, people will still probably remember who Bach was and what he composed.
And Mozart. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've been listening to Breakpoint this week. Thanks for joining us each and every week as we talk about the stories of the culture from a Christian worldview. And don't miss a single episode. You can subscribe to the Breakpoint podcast. And not only will you hear our daily Breakpoint commentaries, you'll hear 2 different pieces of long-form content that we put on each and every week, and our weekly conversation here on Breakpoint this week. And as you consider your end-of-year giving, we would be grateful if you would keep this program and the other ministry outreaches of the Colson Center in mind. Just go to breakpoint.org/give. That's breakpoint.org/give. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. You've been listening to Breakpoint this week.